It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, leader of the Welsh Conservatives, Andrew R.T. Davies, Labour MP Angela Eagle, Green MP Caroline Lucas and Professor of Politics at Kent University Matthew Goodwin. Today, MPs prepare to vote on whether the Prime Minister should be investigated for misleading Parliament.
Boris Johnson is not indispensable, but he is a liar and he is somebody that has misled Parliament.
He's made a very full apology and now wants to move on with the really important issues of the day.
Boris Johnson meets Keir Starmer again at noon. We'll bring you that live.
Access to the UK's asylum system should be based on need, not on the ability to pay people smugglers.
I do not support the removal to Rwanda policy on the grounds of legality, practicality and efficacy.
Current and former Tory Home Secretaries clash over plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. And in the French presidential elections, could it be third time lucky for Marine Le Pen?
What will happen on the 24th of April is not just a vote about conditions. It's a matter of society, even of civilization.
The debate we're going to have is decisive for our country and for Europe.
Let's start with one of the stories you heard there in the headlines about the government's proposal to send asylum seekers to Rwanda if they've arrived on the shores of the UK, as the government says, by unauthorised means. Boris Johnson hit back. Let's take a look at this headline in The Independent. It was behind closed doors talking to Tory MPs last night. Hits back at Archbishop for criticism of Rwanda asylum plan. He told MPs and accused the Archbishop of Canterbury of misconstruing the agreement that has been struck between the UK and Rwanda. In attack mode, has the Archbishop of Canterbury misconstrued the agreement, Andrew?
Well, I think you have to understand why the agreement's come about in the first place, and that's because there is an issue about migrants crossing the Channel to come to this country. 4 or 5 years ago, it was under 500 migrants coming on an annual basis. It's now nearly 30,000 and projected to be nearly 60,000 this year. So the government has to act. It's acted, it's put this agreement in place. Parliament can debate and discuss it, but it's a response to a problem. And I do think that the Archbishop of Canterbury overstepped the mark using his pulpit on Easter Sunday to attack the government on this issue.
Well, that's something slightly different. But has he actually misconstrued what's been agreed?
Well, as I said, I think he's most probably overstepped the mark by what his comments indicated on government policy. There is an issue. The government has put a policy in place to address that issue. If the government didn't act, it'd be criticising for not acting.
Angela, has the policy been misconstrued by the Archbishop?
Well, the policy's been announced by press release. It's not been brought to Parliament. We don't have the details of the costs.
Well,
we know that
we had a statement yesterday, obviously, Priti Patel.
She couldn't give us any details of the costs. She refused to talk about the criteria that would be used. We know that where this kind of policy has been used in Australia, it costs 1.7 million per
It's a different policy,
migrant.
of course, wasn't it? It was offshoring in Australia for
per migrant, and it didn't work, and they haven't used it since 2014. So we'll have to wait and see. And I think the Archbishop has got every right, as the leader of the Church, to talk about the government's morality. We've got a Prime Minister that doesn't know what truth or morality is.
And just to be clear to viewers, offshoring, which was the Australian policy, was for applications, asylum seeker applications, to be processed for staying and leave to remain in Australia. This would be to stay in Rwanda, not coming here.
Exactly. This is a genuine outsourcing of responsibilities. I think it is quite probably illegal and it's most certainly immoral.
Why do you think it's illegal?
Because we are not meant to distinguish between refugees on the basis of where they come from. That shouldn't be part of your immigration policy. We have an absolute responsibility to process people who are claiming asylum in our country. They have a right to do that. What I think is completely wrong about this policy is that it's supposedly designed to break the so-called business model of the people smugglers. The only thing that will break that business model is if the government puts in place safe and legal ways in which people can exercise their legal right under international law to apply for asylum.
And there are are some legal and safe routes.
Very few.
But it's true, it doesn't apply to all countries from which many asylum seekers come from. Do you think the Archbishop of Canterbury has misunderstood or misconstrued the agreement that the government says it struck with Rwanda?
I think he certainly expressed a particular view of the morality of the policy that is not always shared by a large number of British voters. If you look at the polling on this issue, not specifically on the Rwanda plan, but on the principle of sending asylum seekers to third countries and dealing with the processing in those countries, about 60 to 70% of people will say that's fair, that's something that they support. I think it's also worth reminding ourselves that Denmark, the European Union, the United States, among others, also have very specific policies for dealing with this issue in other countries.
Although Denmark
Turkey,
didn't manage to
Mexico.
actually strike that
It's
agreement
also
in the end
it's also
with
the
Rwanda.
case, just while we're discussing it, that the actual principle of sending asylum seekers to third countries was also introduced, in particular under the Labour governments between 97 and 2010, and who also looked at deals with Tanzania and South Africa. I'm not making the case for saying it's moral, but I'm saying this sort of relentless focus on sort of Priti Patel as being, the sort of the architect of all of this. The global discussion is about how we deal with asylum in a fair, reasonable, proportionate way that doesn't incentivise people to lose their lives in one of the busiest shipping ports in the country.
This is going to cost. I mean, you talk about public support for this policy.
Well, actually, we don't know the cost. I mean, Angela is right there.
No, but we can make some assumptions based on existing models of where this is happening. And I just wanted to say that I think public support for this measure will go down as they recognise the costs are massively going up.
Although
plus the fact that... Can I just finish? Plus the fact that I think that we're suggesting that many people, once they get to Rwanda, will try to get away again. Smuggling won't end. We've seen that with the agreement that was had with Israel, that many of the asylum seekers and refugees they sent to Rwanda then tried to get away, quite understandably, because they didn't want to be there, and so you even just drive more smuggling. So it doesn't even address the problem it's set up to address, and it's going to cost a fortune, and it's just wrong.
Andrew?
And as per usual, it's always criticising the policy rather than offering the alternative.
The first thing I said, Andrew, was safe and legal routes.
As I outlined, there's a growing problem. 5 years ago, there was under 500 migrants crossing the Channel to come to this country. Last year, 28,000 came. It's projected to be 60,000. There's a genuine issue there that needs to be addressed. Governments of all colours in this country, Labour under Charles Clarke in 2004 looked at these proposals. This government has put these proposals on the table to say this is part of the solution that we believe will tackle this problem head on. These migrants are coming from countries that are developed, industrialised countries, such as France, with comparable economic indicators
Eritrea.
but they're going through France.
Why in the last year have the number of people smugglers that have been prosecuted by the UK gone down from 59 to 2? If Priti Patel is so interested in breaking this highly dangerous way of getting into the country, then they need to prosecute the people smugglers. And to do that, they need to cooperate with France across borders so that we can break what is a criminal model using the criminal law and bring them to justice.
Hang on a minute. Tens of millions of pounds have been handed over to the French government to work with the French government collaboratively, and I very much hope we'll continue to do that going forward in the future.
Why no prosecution?
But it hasn't faced that issue down of this growing migration problem that is coming across the Channel. This is part of the solution that the government believe is going to sort that problem out. It'll be for the government to be held to account by your good selves in Parliament as MPs, but by the country ultimately when it goes to the polls in 2024.
In principle, do you think it could act as a deterrent?
No, I don't think it will. I think it will just mean that people will arrive on the beaches and try to hide and run away further, to hide in the country rather than give themselves...
remember where they're coming from. It is countries like Iraq and Iran and Eritrea where people's lives are at risk right now. Nobody puts themselves in one of those boats or their children in one of those boats unless what they are escaping from is even more scary and desperate than what they're going to actually find on the Channel.
The data on who's coming and why is a little bit more complicated. There are also people coming from very safe states. Albania is on the list of the top 12 countries that people are coming from. And I do think, actually, most voters do draw a line between need and economic motivation. And one of the risks for those who oppose this plan is we go back to the 2019 general election in 2024, which is a Conservative leader saying there is a plan It's broadly in line with the public preference for lower migration and for a tougher response. And so far this week, one of the things I've found remarkable is nobody has put forward a credible alternative plan to the Rwanda plan. And I would say to Labour, Lib Dem, Greens and others, SNP, that needs to be the political priority. What's the alternative to this plan?
Safe and legal routes, so that if people are abusing the immigration system, you weed them out and you make sure that that isn't allowed to happen. But at the moment, we don't have those safe and legal routes, and that's why more and more people are driven to more and more desperate ways to get here.
The Home Office last year halved the number of asylum decisions that it took. Why is the Home Office only being half as effective this year as it was last year?
Well, most of the appeals are upheld.
Well, that was a question, I think, one of the many questions put to Priti Patel, and I have to say I can't quite remember the answer from the Home Secretary. Let's move on, because Boris Johnson was in attack mode when it came to this particular policy to deal with, as they see it, asylum seekers. He was much more contrite over the issues of parties at Downing Street, having received that fine. We have just received the text of a motion that Labour is putting to Parliament asking the Privileges Committee, it's called, to investigate if the Prime Minister misled Parliament over the issue of parties at Downing Street. We'll talk about that in just a moment. That is actually scheduled for tomorrow. Let's go back and listen to, first of all, Boris Johnson making one of many apologies in the House of Commons in front of MPs, then by Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, and Tory MP Mark Harper.
As soon as I received the notice, I acknowledged the hurt and the anger. And I said that people had a right to expect better of their Prime Minister. And I repeat that, Mr. Speaker, again in the House now. Let me also say, not by way of mitigation or excuse, but purely because it explains my previous words in this House, that it did not occur to me then or subsequently that a gathering in the Cabinet room just before a vital meeting on COVID strategy could amount to a breach of the rules.
Even now, as the latest mealy-mouthed apology stumbles out of one side of his mouth, a new set of deflections and distortions pour from the other. But the damage is already done. The public have made up their mind. They don't believe a word the Prime Minister says. They know what he is.
I regret to say that we have a Prime Minister who broke the laws that he told the country they had to follow, hasn't been straightforward about it, and is now going to ask the decent men and women on these benches to defend what I think is indefensible. I'm very sorry to have to say this, but I no longer think he is worthy of the great office that he holds.
Andrew, why is Mark Harper wrong?
Well, ultimately, there'll be a debate tomorrow and it'll be debated and voted on in the House of Commons. Mark Harper is perfectly entitled to put his point of view over.
Why is he wrong on the issue?
I've always said, from my perspective, that the Prime Minister needs to be able to command the majority in the party, majority in the parliamentary party and a majority in the country. That majority was given to him from the country's vote in 2019 to be a Prime Minister for 5 years. He's got to command the majority in the House of Commons of the parliamentary party so he can continue in that job.
To some extent, that's process, or to every extent it's process. But in terms of your personal view, is Mark Harper right that you and your colleagues are being asked to defend the indefensible when it comes to the issues of parties at Downing Street?
Well, I have said time and time again from my position, I want to see the Sue Gray report in its entirety. I want to understand entirely what the investigation... Well, you might say manana, but it's due process at the end of the day. The police have obviously served a fixed penalty notice, 50 of them to date. That process is ongoing, but I have been consistent from the new year onwards that I want to see the Sue Gray report in its entirety. The Prime Minister said he will go to the House of Commons and speak to that report and take the questions on the floor of the House of Commons from all MPs, and it'll be for my colleagues in the House of Commons to form an opinion whether they have sufficient confidence in him to continue as Prime Minister by giving him a majority. That is the process that will keep him in office. Well, since
you've gone down the route of process, let's introduce Dr Alice Lilly of the Institute for Government. Alice, hearing Andrew describe what is going to happen tomorrow, we have received this motion, the wording of it. Just take us through what we can expect to happen.
So tomorrow MPs will be asked to vote on whether the matter of the Prime Minister potentially misleading Parliament should be referred to the Privileges Committee. That is a cross-party group of MPs. It's chaired by a Labour MP, Chris Bryant, but it has a Conservative majority on the committee. And if tomorrow's motion passes, that committee will be able to look into the Prime Minister's previous statements to Parliament. It will be able to investigate whether he has misled Parliament. And they will then report back to the House of Commons at some point, and it will be up to MPs to then vote on their findings and on their recommendations.
Right. In terms of Conservative MPs, will it be, as we call it, a whipped vote? Will Tory MPs be told to vote against this motion?
We don't yet know, and it's interesting that the Prime Minister was explicitly asked that question in the House yesterday. He did not give a clear answer. Certainly, a lot of the newspapers this morning are reporting that it will be a three-line whip, so Conservative MPs will be required to be in the Commons and vote against the motion tomorrow. That, politically speaking, is quite a big call by the government, not least because the Prime Minister himself is due to be out of the country tomorrow.
Yes.
And of course, if we think back to late last year, the last time that the government tried to whip its own MPs on a standards issue relating to Owen Paterson, that was not something that went down particularly well with its own backbenchers.
No, because, as you say, it didn't unfold in quite the way the government wanted to. But on the numbers that are in Parliament at the moment, it's bound to fail.
Yes, I think that's right. We know that there are, of course, some Conservative MPs who are very unhappy with what has been happening. We heard Mark Harper yesterday. But the government's majority in the House of Commons is so large, you would not expect the vote to go against them tomorrow. I think, though, what Labour will be thinking about in tabling this motion, even though they know that practically it's not likely to pass, is that it's forcing those Conservative backbenchers to walk through those division lobbies tomorrow, put their support for the Prime Minister on the public record, and of course in thinking about that they will have an eye to those local elections in England on May the 5th.
Alice Lilly, thank you very much. Angela, it's bound to fail.
Well, we have to get everybody in Parliament on the record about whether they think that the Prime Minister, who has lied to Parliament, ought to be held to account for it. The entirety of our system relies on ministers telling the truth in Parliament. If the Prime Minister has lied in Parliament, then our system of truth-telling so that we can hold the government to account in Parliament collapses completely. The stakes are very, very high here. The Prime Minister is the person that is meant to look after the ministerial code, which explicitly says that no ministers in the government are above the law, and if they break the law, they should resign. He has broken the law. He has also got to decide whether he's the final arbiter on whether he has broken the ministerial code by lying to Parliament. If that system breaks down, then we have to change our constitutional arrangements to ensure that we have a different one. This is a man without shame, a man who has no relationship with the truth, who will do anything and say anything to get him off the hook of today's problem. Well, then, there's no institution he won't trash to keep himself in power.
Right, and it's interesting. Well, hang on, Angela. Let me just interject. Yes, but I'm saying I don't think you will be able to if enough Conservative MPs. But hang on,
Tory MP who goes through the lobby voting for a liar. A Prime Minister who is a liar. Well, he's not in the Commons.
Well, no, but I mean, your colleagues then. What would you say to them, Andrew?
Well, with the greatest respect to Andrew, she can go on as much as she wants, but I went through a similar process in the Welsh Parliament when there was a tragedy of a minister taking his life there, and the ministerial code, which is beholden to the First Minister's judgment on this time and time again, and the then First Minister Carwyn Jones, and we had the same issues there time and time again. I'd be supportive of an independent ministerial code. I believe there needs to be an independent arbitrator on the ministerial code. It's something I have talked about at length from the Welsh perspective because we've gone through this process. But it is a fact. I've talked to you about the arrangements that are in place to obviously, if people lose confidence in the Prime Minister, in the parliamentary party, he can be removed. I have the confidence in the Prime Minister on the evidence I've seen that he should be allowed to fulfil his mandate that he secured in 2019, and the country will be able to decide on that.
These votes are never normally whipped.
Angela,
why are they whipping them?
If you say it's a matter of such such critical importance. It's curious that Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, really quite recently said that given there is a war going on with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, all our focus needs to be on Ukraine and the UK must be united. What's changed?
Well, the Prime Minister's been issued with a fixed notice. 50 fixed penalty notices have been issued
but actually
so
preceding
far.
what I've just read out, Keir Starmer had called for Boris Johnson to resign. So
it's quite clear that the position on Ukraine is supported across the House and would be supported and unchanged by any new Conservative Prime Minister. So that is a red herring with respect to the integrity of the current holder of the post. Democracy can only survive if truth is respected. This Prime Minister does not respect the truth.
Right, but of course we don't know exactly how it will unfold tomorrow, although it looks likely that enough Conservative MPs will vote against the motion. What about the Court of Public Opinion, Matthew? Because those local elections are coming up. Is there a sense in your mind that the Tory brand is trashed over this whole issue of Partygate, or is it being seen in a slightly different way?
Well, Boris Johnson is definitely damaged goods in the minds of many voters. Majorities have suggested this week that they feel he should resign. The government's net competency rating, as we call it, has declined considerably. And I think the local elections, which of course will be held across the Red Wall, that all-important piece of territory for Johnson, in fact, really his premiership rests on his ability to show that he can hold that territory, I think will be very difficult for the Conservative Party. Having said that, it is also true that if we go back in British political history and we look at big scandals, take the expenses scandal as an example, which obviously affected all parties, not just one, but we routinely exaggerate the long-term electoral effect of these crises. The expenses scandal actually did not have a seismic effect at the next general election. Now, I may be wrong on this, but I do think the lesson of the last 10 years in British politics is actually to never underestimate Johnson.
I think this is so different from the expenses scandal in the sense that people up and down the country have a visceral experience of what they've gone through.
Caroline.
I don't, because it wasn't a matter of, by and large, of life and death for people.
It's a matter of politicians ripping off much of the country.
Yes, but if you weren't able to see your dying mother, I think I would argue that that affects you in a rather more visceral way than your very righteous anger against MPs ripping off the country. And that is what I think is different about this. I think that sense that when people were making such sacrifices in their own lives, while apparently these parties were taking place in Downing Street, has hit a nerve in a way that I think you're underestimating. And I think that if I could just finish, I, for that reason, believe that actually this is a watershed moment. I agree that because, unfortunately, not enough Tory MPs are going to develop a spine between now and tomorrow, that the motion is unlikely to pass. But at the same time, I think it is hugely important to demonstrate to the public that we are doing our very best to hold this rogue Prime Minister to account, because that's what he's become.
Just to be clear, what I'm not saying is this hasn't touched a nerve. What I am saying is come 2024, amid the biggest cost of living crisis this country has seen for over 10 years, war in Ukraine, etc., 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 this will probably not have the big effect on the election that some people are currently assuming it will. Only about 1% of Conservative MPs have currently called for Johnson to go. His party will almost certainly keep him in power. My personal view is irrespective of what happens at the local elections. I think he will probably limp on through this year into next year. And I suspect then he will be able to point to other issues that will deflect from this current scandal. I mean, this is just my personal view. I don't think it will
Andy,
be.
Do you think Boris Johnson will be the person who leads the Conservatives into the next election?
Well, if that landscape doesn't change going towards 2024, he will be the Prime Minister who will lead us into that general election. But politics is a fickle old business and things change not day by day, but by minute in today's current climate. I would like to see the Prime Minister lead us into 2024. We've seen what that leadership has delivered on the vaccination programme, on the Ukrainian support and making sure that we're there for with the greatest respect, politicians had to take the call to order those vaccination doses so that they could be injected. The heroic work of the NHS was critical.
To do that.
Well, many other countries didn't do it, and we were first out of the stocks, and we were lifting the restrictions back in December before what many other countries were doing. That's why people out there today are enjoying the freedoms they have.
All right, we're going to talk about the French presidential election. Sunday is the final runoff. Tonight is a big night too. The remaining candidates, Marine Le Pen and the incumbent, Emmanuel Macron, go head-to-head in a live televised debate. And in the first round of voting, we saw Macron and Le Pen secure the top places. Let me just show you this graph of some of the other candidates. You can see there the top two. Then Jean-Luc Mélenchon from the far left, quite close behind Marine Le Pen with her party National Rally. Far right candidate Eric Zemmour on just over 7%, and Valérie Pécresse, who was representing one of the mainstream centre-right parties, collapsing to 4.8%. The Socialists were even lower and don't even make the graph. Let's talk to Sophie Pedder, who is the Paris bureau chief for The Economist newspaper. Sophie, I think the line isn't great, but we're going to persevere. Tell us what was significant about the first round of voting.
I think the main point is the complete collapse of the mainstream parties, the two mainstream parties, so the Socialists on the left and the Republicans on the centre-right, who have dominated politics under the Fifth Republic in France until Emmanuel Macron won power. And what he's done with this sort of centrist party is occupy a huge space in the middle of French politics that has just squeezed out those two candidates altogether. Anne Hidalgo, look at the Socialist candidate. She's the mayor of Paris, and yet she didn't even make 2% in the first round. And the corollary, in a way, the sort of flip side of this has been the extremes have become the main opposition to Macron. And that, is represented in that if you combine all of those votes for radicals, populists, extremists of one sort or another on the left and the right, you get to about 58% of the vote. And I think that's the sort of worrying darker side of the success Macron's had at creating this centrist party.
What's your best guess for Sunday?
Well, look, Emmanuel Macron is leading in the polls, and I think that he is well placed to be re-elected, which in itself would be a historic achievement. There hasn't been a sitting president elected for 20 years, but Marine Le Pen has never been this close, and we've all lived through votes that we have got wrong and predicted underestimated the strength of populists' opinion, and so it's never over until it's over. But Macron is looking the strongest candidate and very well placed now to win on Sunday.
OK, we're showing some campaign pictures there of Marine Le Pen addressing the audience and now Emmanuel Macron. Sophie, what happens with the all-important Mélenchon voters? Because he polled 22%. Do you think they will, in the majority, support Macron?
I think in the majority that they will probably abstain or, spoil the ballot papers. They're not keen on voting for Macron at all. Most polls suggest that around a third of them might turn out and vote for him, but around a fifth might actually vote for Marine Le Pen. Don't forget that some of Mélenchon's voters aren't ideologically left-wing so much as attracted by a lot of his promises to help them with the cost of living, which Marine Le Pen also promises. So the blue-collar vote for Mélenchon could well go partly to Marine Le Pen, but he did represent nearly 8 million voters in the first round, and that is really where you've seen Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen this week on the campaign trail, trying to campaign in the hunt for those votes on the left.
Sophie Pedder, thank you very much for joining us. I'm just going to read you all something that Emmanuel Macron said to a TV show, an interview he was giving. Think back to what British citizens were saying hours before the Brexit referendum, or in the US before the Trump vote came. I'm not voting. What's the point? Well, Macron says, I can tell you the next day they regretted it. If you want to avoid the unthinkable or something that revolts you, choose for yourself. What's your response to that?
Well, I think he's right to point to those previous elections. Marine Le Pen is essentially within a polling error of winning the French presidency. And we do tend to forget how seismic this is, 2002, I'm sure some of us will remember when her father reached the final round, shocked the world with 18%, and she's looking like she's going to get somewhere between 40 and 45%. But I do think there are two key significant points about this. One is it's a reminder that COVID has not killed populism. We were told by a number of commentators and experts at the time that COVID would restore our faith in experts and technocrats, and clearly, you know, we've underestimated the stubborn persistence of this movement. And secondly, who is voting for Marine Le Pen? A lot of young women, 18 to 30 years of age, typically working in the hospitality sector, low-skilled service sector. Their number one issue is not immigration, cost of living. And what's she offering them? Taking them out of income tax, 0% loans for young families, alongside some pretty hard stuff on Islam and immigration. But it just is a reminder that, you know, this stuff isn't actually going away anytime soon, and the voters are younger than we often think. Not angry old white men, for example, much more diverse.
Why are the centrist parties failing so much, or the socialists on the left and the Republicans on the right?
I think the problem has been that the models of mixed economies and capitalism that we've been running since Thatcher haven't delivered enough for working people, and they haven't delivered growing standard of living, and they have delivered more and more extremes between the rich and those that don't have enough to get by on. Look at the food banks in our own country, look at the cost of living squeeze. If the system that is being run is not delivering for people, then people, understandably, in a democracy, look to change the system. And the rise of the populist right, the ethno-nationalist populist right, of which Trump is an example, of which Marine Le Pen, the Alternative for Deutschland, Putin at the extreme end, that is what is happening in the whole of Western society. And the only way we save democracy, the only way we actually get to have a system that isn't populist, that doesn't seek to be anti-democratic, is to ensure that our system delivers for the majority of people, to have a fair and more equal system, but it's also, not one that is failing. And that is the key thing
but
that has to be addressed.
But it's a failure of... Sorry, Andrew, you go.
I was just about to say, it was only 12 months ago, a little under 12 months ago, that we were all saying it's the election of the incumbents. Because in this country, we had the Scottish parliamentary elections, the Welsh parliamentary elections, and the swathe of local elections here in England. And the incumbents benefited from their incumbency. So the electorate does move with the times, and it also moves back with the times as well then. What is of real significance, I think, is in the French model, where you have Le Pen and her father polling about 17%, then at the last election polled about 35%, at this election looking about the mid-40s as well then. You know, that is showing a massive body of opinion that is warming to those type of policies. I don't subscribe to those policies.
You don't?
I don't subscribe to Le Pen's policies at all. I think they've got a pretty grim choice on Sunday, to be honest with you, between Macron and Le Pen. But ultimately, it was only 12 months ago, as I said, in this country, we were celebrating the incumbency of governments both in Scotland, Wales and here in Westminster.
I think it's much more grave than just the issue of whether or not it's to do with incumbency. I think this is a massive indictment on the so-called establishment parties who simply have not delivered for vast swathes of the countries that they're active in. And so I think people are rightly angry. They are rightly seeing that the benefits of economic development aren't going to them. The inequality is growing. And I think there's also an anger with the electoral systems themselves. Look at that, the graph that you've got there. 22% of people who voted for Mélenchon, only 1% or so behind
and he's
Le Pen.
a far-left candidate.
And, well, we can decide how far, but anyway, he's to the left.
Described as far-left, further left than the socialists.
Indeed. And yet, all of those people who voted for him, the 8 million, where are they going to go? And so, in a sense, when you've got a system that deliberately leaves out so many people, then I think you're going to get people getting even more angry.
They decide the outcome, Caroline.
Exactly. But so why don't we have an electoral system that allows the debate to continue with the more people who have got more of those views?
Right, but something that Matthew raises about policies. I mean, is there a failure of policies appealing to young people, for example, from the socialists?
They've had a really rough deal.
And the Labour Party here.
I mean, young people have had a really rough deal. The old idea that parents could expect their children to do better than they themselves have done has gone because of the way that our economic system skews wealth to the very wealthy. You have to redistribute. You have to have a more radical way of ensuring that the proceeds of economic activity...
It's not about redistribution, it's about empowerment at the end of the day. And people feel that they can get on in society. And we've seen the housing problems because we just haven't been building enough housing in this country.
I was in the middle of saying that when you interrupted
me.
Well,
with the greatest respect, you were talking about redistribution, the typical Labour model, which has failed. What we haven't been able to do, and guilty as charged, we haven't managed to energise and empower enough people to feel that they have a stake in society. We can do a lot better.
Young people under this government have now got a nearly 43% rate of tax because if they've been to university.
And you don't feel very empowered if you're dependent on food banks, if you're worrying every night about how you're going to get food on the table in the morning. Come on, the empowerment is important, but so is redistribution, because without that, then we're not going to have people in a position to be able to take that power.
Social mobility.
Well, hang on, let Matthew...
Sorry, I was just going to say there is a message...
hang on, let the others in. Go on, Matthew.
There is a message in there too for British politics, which is the very poor performance of parties on the left in the French election. And
except for Mélenchon.
Well, Mélenchon did OK. The French socialists completely collapsed.
No, they did pretty well.
Well, not he did OK, but the combined left-wing vote was not as big as it should have been, and many working-class voters have clearly not gone back to the left. Now, there's a lesson in this for the Red Wall. There's a lesson in this for British politics, which is, I think, still social democracy across much of the West. We're seeing it in Biden's numbers as well. We're seeing it in parts of Southern Europe. Hasn't got that big, bold, appealing message that it had in earlier decades, right? And that's a real problem.
More radical policies. You know, where is the debate about things like a basic income? Where's the debate about a land value tax? At the moment, we are just arguing about, 2% of the kind of difference between the Tories and Labour. What we need to have is a much wider debate and much bolder policies. That would be attracting young people to come to them. And do you think Keir Starmer needs to be more radical in terms of what he's offering to distinguish the Labour Party more from the Conservative government?
I think at the next election there will be a big radical bold offer from Keir Starmer and the Labour
Party. Well, let Angela finish and I'll come to...
It'll be a big radical bold offer. If you look at things like the windfall tax for the unearned huge mega profits of the energy companies, the changes to a huge retooling and green transition to ensure that we deal with some of these huge strategic problems that we have. I'm on the Treasury Select Committee. I got them to agree that we should consider a wealth tax.
Good, we've agreed on that one. Get Keir to agree to it.
All right.
Well, with the greatest respect, Keir came to Wales...
I'm so sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you because we're going to have to take a minor pause for just a moment as we come up to PMQs. Just like to welcome viewers from the news channel. We have about 7 or 8 minutes to go until Prime Minister's questions, when Boris Johnson will yet again face Keir Starmer, as he did yesterday when he gave his statement, which was including response to the Partygate issue. We can see there inside the Commons chamber as MPs gather. It was very crowded yesterday. We had, of course, first of all, the statement from Priti Patel, which we discussed earlier on in this programme, about asylum seekers being sent to Rwanda. That was followed by the Prime Minister's statement, which wrapped up his response to Ukraine, or certainly bringing MPs up to date, as well as issues around the cost of living. But, of course, the focus of many MPs was on the fixed penalty notice that he had received. Let's talk to our chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming. We had sort of part one of the showdown yesterday, if you like, Adam, between Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer. Today, PMQs. It's going to be part two?
Yeah, and I suspect it's part two leading to part three, which is tomorrow, because the big thing that's going to happen tomorrow is this potential vote on a motion that's been put forward by Labour to refer the Prime Minister to the Privileges Committee, which is the committee of MPs that looks at whether people have misled Parliament or held Parliament in contempt by their actions or their words in the chamber. The irony being, though, that Boris Johnson's fate will be being discussed while Boris Johnson is not there, because he's getting on a plane to India this afternoon, and so this possible referral to the Privileges Committee about him will happen without him. So I just wonder if the Labour leader Keir Starmer will want to kind of make today a bit more of a Boris Johnson trial, just to provide some material and a bit of a denouement for the vote tomorrow, because we're not going to see the Prime Minister tomorrow.
Right, now, yes, tell us about that, because as you say, he's not here, or he won't be here from tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting politically. Like, sometimes these trips are seen as like the Prime Minister skulking away to try and avoid a domestic crisis. Number 10 are pitching this as a big, important trade mission with a big new trading partner, and that is kind of part of the getting on with the job package that they're kind of unveiling. And there's going to be other stuff in the next few weeks as well, more on the cost of living. And apparently Boris Johnson is working on a big plan to get economic growth firing again, as an attempt to sort of draw a line under Partygate and get a move on. But I think we've still got a few details to iron out about what's going to happen tomorrow, though. The text of the Labour motion hasn't actually been tabled yet. There's lots of speculation about what it will include, that it will refer to specific instances where Labour feel that the Prime Minister misled the House. But also, I also think that they're going to suggest that the Privileges Committee doesn't look at it until the Met Police investigation has been concluded. Now, the reason you would do that is to just get a few more votes on your side to kind of knock off that argument of, oh, it wouldn't be appropriate to press ahead with a parliamentary investigation into the Prime Minister while he's still being investigated by the police.
Right.
But the other thing we're hearing is that the government manoeuvre on this will be to propose their own amendment to that motion, cancelling the referral to the Privileges Committee and doing something kind of a bit more positive about the response to Partygate, and that Tory MPs would be whipped to vote for that amendment instead, because then you wouldn't be accused, if you were the Tories, of kind of trying to block an investigation or being anti-democratic if you actually just propose an alternative and get your MPs to vote for that. Yes. Also, it might be getting more Tory MPs to vote for that, because a fair few of them are a bit worried about the Partygate stuff.
No, well, absolutely. We've discussed it at some length earlier on in the programme, Adam. But as you say, it will give Conservative MPs something to vote for rather than against the motion, obviously designed to make it as difficult as possible, because the numbers are obviously stacked against the opposition. You are absolutely right. The wording I have here is that it won't actually be considered, or at least Labour doesn't want it to be considered by the Privileges Committee until the investigation by the Metropolitan Police has been concluded. It doesn't mention or make reference to the Sue Gray report, the senior civil servant who carried out her own inquiry, and we have only really had a sort of a flavour or a summary of that. We're still waiting for that too, aren't we?
Yeah, and Sue Gray's not allowed to publish her report until the Metropolitan Police have fully completed their inquiry, and they're incredibly vague about what the timeline is, and we have no idea how long it will take them to crunch through all the various Partygate allegations. I'm glad you got the motion and you read it out, because actually we got sent it a few minutes ago and I wasn't sure we were allowed to quote from it, but you've made that clear that we can.
Too late. I've got it here, and so I'm afraid I have quoted from it extensively. Stay with us, Adam, if you can, just until we go to PMQs. I just want to put one line from Boris Johnson in terms of what will be discussed in this motion tomorrow, put forward by the opposition. He said in response to a question about one of the parties that has been investigated, I am sure, Boris Johnson said, whatever happened, the guidance was followed and the rules were followed at all times. Do you believe that can still be true, knowing what we now know and the Metropolitan Police having said that Boris Johnson has broken the law?
Well, I've said at the start of the programme, and I'll continue this line because it's something I've been talking about for the last 3 months, we need to see the entirety of what Sue Gray reports on, because she's had ample evidence put before her. The police are continuing their inquiries. Yeah, your correspondent indicated there that actually the motion that you read out, there's some debate about what is actually going to be before the House tomorrow.
But even on the basis of what we know, can that be true?
I appreciate from the opposition side of things that they'll want to try and put as much mud out there as possible. But I am following the process. And we have the Metropolitan Police undertaking their investigation. We have the Sue Gray report, the partial report that's been released, but the entire report that is a commitment of the government to release once the investigations are complete, and questions will be held in the House. That is the line that I will compete with all the time against the speculation that's constantly coming out.
All right, before you do, because we know very much where opposition parties stand, of course, and legitimately so. Adam, I just wanted to ask about Conservative MPs, because they met, as they do, yesterday evening, and Boris Johnson addressed them. Do we have any sense of the mood, apart from what we heard in the House of Commons yesterday from the likes, of course, of Mark Harper, who said he no longer had confidence in the Prime Minister?
I mean, it's really hard to sum up, Joe. First of all, because there are quite a lot of Conservative MPs, and also there are still quite a lot who are still making up their minds. Okay, you've got the definite people who've come forward and said they don't have confidence in the Prime Minister, which is up one, with Mark Harper saying that yesterday. And from the BBC's calculations about the number of letters calling for no confidence vote, we think that's increasing. And it's around the kind of early 20s, late teens mark. Right. Then you've got a larger group of kind of uber loyalists who are just saying, this is it, it's done, Partygate's over, we support the Prime Minister, he's our guy. But then by far the much bigger group of people who are still kind of sitting on the fence, and they're waiting for various things like, are there more fines? And do those fines apply to events that maybe seem a bit more egregious than the sort of semi-accidental birthday party? Then you've got others who are waiting for to see what the effect of this is on the May elections. Then you've got other people waiting for the completion of the Met Police inquiry. Then you've got other people waiting for the Sue Gray report. Then you've got other people waiting for some kind of saviour to come along as a potential replacement for Boris Johnson, which they might be waiting for some time. And then you've got people just waiting, hoping this all goes away. Right. What was interesting yesterday, and this is a really kind of dweeby, nerdy parliamentary legislative point. Yesterday was the second reading of the Online Safety Bill, a huge landmark piece of legislation tackling some huge issues in the real world that are affecting people, and it's a massive piece of legislation. Loads of MPs wanted to speak about it yesterday in the debate, but the debate got cut short because they spent 2 hours talking about Partygate. So that is an example of some of the oxygen being sucked out of what the government is doing by Partygate.
All right, I'm going to have to stop you there because I've just seen the Prime Minister walk into the chamber and take his place. We may have a moment more before Prime Minister's questions actually starts. I can see the Minister there still answering questions. Did you briefly want to come back, Matt? You looked as if you wanted to.
No, I was only going to make the point that the political context has also changed in that Boris Johnson's big competitors within his party, Rishi Sunak notably, they've become much weaker over the last 2 or 3 weeks as well, and that is weighing on some MPs' minds.
But won't it be death by 1,000 cuts, which is what David
Davis...
I think that's it. I think Lindsay Hall, the Speaker, has just called Prime Minister's questions. Let's go inside the chamber.
Dr Neil Hudson.
Question 1, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, I know the whole House will want to join me in wishing Her Majesty the Queen a very happy birthday for tomorrow. Mr Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today. I will then be travelling to India to deepen the strategic trade, defence and people-to-people ties between our two countries, building on India's involvement in the Carbis Bay G7 summit. I'll be seeing Prime Minister Modi in Delhi, meeting Indian business people investing in the UK and visiting British investments in India.
Dr Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Challenges with rural transport remain some of the greatest obstacles facing people in Penrith and the border, and I was pleased last year to see, on top of the government's £3 billion national bus strategy helping areas like Cumbria, that Cumbria County Council received an additional £1.5 million to enhance provision as part of the Rural Mobility Fund. But I'm sure my right honourable friend can only imagine my disappointment this month when Cumbria was allocated no funding from the latest tranche of bus funding. Can the Prime Minister reassure my constituents that Cumbria can look forward to future funding schemes to improve our vital rural bus services?
Prime Minister.
OK, Mike, I thank my honourable friend. He is a great champion for rural Cumbria and for bus services, and he's right that Cumbria got another £1.5 million. We do, for buses, we do want to put more into buses. I believe in them passionately myself, and I will make sure that he has a meeting with the relevant minister.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in wishing Her Majesty a happy birthday? Why did the Prime Minister's Press Secretary, Allegra Stratton, have to resign from her job?
Minister.
Sorry. I bitterly regret Allegra's resignation. I think it was very sad, and I think she did an outstanding job. I do, particularly since she was the one who coined the expression coal, cars, cash and trees, which enabled the UK to deliver a fantastic COP26 summit last year.
Keir Starmer.
Allegra Strachan laughed at breaking the rules. She resigned. The Prime Minister then claimed he was furious at her behaviour and accepted her resignation. Professor Neil Ferguson broke the rules. He also resigned. The Prime Minister said that was the right thing to do. The former Health Secretary broke the rules. He too resigned. The Prime Minister tried to claim he sacked him. Why does the Prime Minister think everybody else's actions have consequences except his own?
I thank the right honourable gentleman. I feel he's in some kind of Doctor Who time warp. We had this conversation yesterday, Mr. Speaker, and I've explained why I bitterly regret receiving an FPN. I apologise to the House. But he asks about the actions for which I take responsibility. And I'll tell him we're going to get on with delivering for the British people, making sure that we power out of the problems that COVID has left us, and more people in work than there were before the pandemic, Mr. Speaker, fixing our energy problems and leading the world in standing up to the aggression of Vladimir Putin. Those are all subjects about which I think he could reasonably ask questions now.
These are strange answers from a man who yesterday claimed to be making a humble apology. Does the Prime Minister actually accept that he broke the law?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I've been absolutely clear that I humbly accept what the police have said. I've paid the fixed penalty notice. And, Mr. Speaker, what I think the country and what I think the whole House would really rather do is get on with the things for which we were elected, deliver on our promises to the British people. And you could not have clearer evidence of the intellectual bankruptcy of Labour. They have no plans. They have no plans for energy. They have no plans for social care, and they have no plans, Mr. Speaker, to fix the economy.
Prime Minister, sit down. I want to hear what you've got to say, but I can't hear when you're talking that way. I'm here in the chair. Please, if you can help me. No, I think we'll have had enough.
The state of it, the party of Peel and Churchill reduced to shouting and screaming in defence of this lawbreaker.
Now then, that's the last time that parole that you just asked about, you might have to go and take it. I don't hear any more, or else you will be drinking. Keir Starmer.
So, Mr. Speaker, yesterday's apology lasted for as long as the Prime Minister thought necessary to be clipped for the news. But once the cameras were off, the Prime Minister went to see his backbenchers, and he was back to blaming everyone else. He even said that the Archbishop of Canterbury had not been critical enough of Putin. In fact, the Archbishop called Putin's war an act of great evil, and the Church of England has led the way in providing refuge to those fleeing. Would the Prime Minister like to take this opportunity to apologise for slandering the Archbishop and the Church of England?
Mr. Speaker, I think the right honourable gentleman. I was slightly taken aback to be Sorry, Mr. Speaker. I was slightly taken aback for the government to be criticised over the policy that we have devised to end the deaths at sea in the Channel as a result of cruel criminal gangs. I was surprised that we were attacked for that. And actually, Mr. Speaker, it turns out that policy, do you know who proposed that policy, first of all, in 2004? It was David Blunkett, Mr. Speaker, who said it was a 21st century solution to the problems of illegal asylum seeking and immigration. He should stick with, he's a Corbynista in a smart Islington suit. That's the truth.
I think you'll find Mr. Corbyn doesn't have the whip. But I think that's a no then. Pathetic. He never takes responsibility for his words or action. They were all there. The Prime Minister also accused the BBC of not being critical enough of Putin. Would the Prime Minister have the guts to say that to the face of Clive Myrie, Lise Doucet and Steve Rosenberg, who have all risked their lives day in, day out on the front line in Russia and Ukraine, uncovering Putin's barbarism?
If the right honourable gentleman wants to join the Conservative Party and come and listen to the meetings of the Conservative Party, he's welcome to do it. But though, as I say, I think he's a Corbynista in an Islington suit. But I said nothing of the kind. And I have the highest admiration as a journalist and a former journalist for what journalists do. I think they do an outstanding. I mean, I think he should withdraw what he just said. It has absolutely no basis or foundation in truth.
Keir Starmer.
That's how he operates. A mealy-mouthed apology when the cameras roll, a vicious attack on those who tell the truth as soon as the cameras are off. Slander decent people in a private room. Let the slander spread without the backbone to repeat it in public. How can the Prime Minister claim to be a patriot when he deliberately attacks and degrades the institutions of our great country?
Prime Minister, how many has he had? Mr. Speaker, sorry, Mr. Speaker.
No, Prime Minister, just a second. I want to hear the Prime Minister's answers. I expect it both ways. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is an indication of the depths to which he's willing to sink. That he accuses me. He accuses me of traducing journalists. What he says is completely without any foundation whatever. I did not attack the BBC last night. For their coverage of Ukraine, he must be out of his tiny mind, Mr. Speaker. He must be out of his tiny mind. I said no such thing, and there are people behind who will testify to that. He is completely wrong, Mr. Speaker. That is the limit. That is the limit of his willingness to ask sensible questions today. We are getting on. This government is getting on with the serious problems that require attention. Fixing our energy supply issues. And by the way, undoing the damage of the Labour government that didn't invest in nuclear power for 13 years. We're the nuclear power station every year. Standing up to Putin, Mr. Speaker, when he would have elected a Putin apologist. That's what he wanted to do. And he campaigned to do that. Mr. Speaker, and fixing our economy with record numbers of people now in work, productivity back above what it was, more than 500,000 people back on the payroll than there were before the pandemic began, Mr. Speaker. That is as a result of the decisions, the tough calls this government has made. We get on with the job while they flip-flop around like beached flounders on the beach, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Founded in Hitchin by an inspirational man called Richard Lucas, the GoVox mental well-being platform was started in 2018 following the sad loss of some local young men to suicide. Since then, working with brilliant partners like NHSX, King's College London and others, the technology platform and support services have grown to support the mental well-being and mental health of over 40,000 young people in over 10 countries. Today, GoVox is launching its campaign to offer its services free to over 1,000 state secondary schools. Would the Prime Minister welcome this initiative, perhaps go to Hitchin and meet the people from GoVox? And secondly, could he set out what more we can do to help young people and young men with the problems of mental health and mental well-being?
Prime Minister.
Yeah. I thank him very much. I thank my honourable friend. I'm very pleased to hear about the work that GoVox is doing to support mental health and well-being, and we're putting more money into mental health care support, an extra £2.3 billion a year in the next financial year, which of course we can supply thanks to the decisions taken by this government, which actually that party opposed.
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition in wishing Her Majesty the Queen best wishes for her birthday tomorrow. Mr Speaker, last night the Prime Minister might have convinced his backbenchers and his spineless Scottish Tories to keep him in place for another few weeks. But the public aren't so easily fooled. 82% of people in Scotland said they believe the Prime Minister lied to this Parliament and to the public about his law-breaking COVID parties. Are they right? Or should they not believe their lying eyes?
Prime Minister.
I thank the right honourable gentleman. We had a long conversation about this yesterday. I understand the point of his question, but we are going to get on with the job of delivering for the people of the whole of the United Kingdom.
If the Prime Minister wants to get on, he should be offering his resignation to the Queen before her birthday. Mr Speaker, no government can be led by a Prime Minister who's in a constant state of crisis to save his own skin. And what's worse, the UK government is now led by a tag team of scandal, a Prime Minister who can't be trusted with the truth, and a Chancellor who can't be trusted with his taxes. Everyone knows that this Prime Minister is now on borrowed time until the Tory backbenchers count the cost of their council election defeat. But in the meantime, families are counting the cost of a Tory-made cost of living crisis every day. After yesterday's farce, isn't it finally the time for him to accept that neither his party or the public can afford to keep him around as Prime Minister for 1 minute longer?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, if that were true, then I don't think he'd be calling for my resignation. That's what we're going to do is get on with the job in hand, and that is deliver for the entire people of this country. And by the way, Mr Speaker, he hasn't answered the point I made yesterday, which is I think is still incredible, that at a time when we need to stand up to aggression from Vladimir Putin, it is still the policy of the Scottish Nationalist Party to get rid of this country's unilateral defence.
We have a closed question, Philip Holloway.
For three, sir.
I thank my honourable friend. He's an excellent champion for Kettering, and we're fully committed to the delivery of the new hospital for Kettering. The release of funding will be subject to the usual business case assessment process.
The redevelopment of Kettering General Hospital is the #1 local priority for residents in Kettering and across Northamptonshire. Would my right honourable friend be kind enough, please, to facilitate a meeting with the Health Secretary for the 3 members for Kettering, Wellingborough, Corby, together with the Hospital Chief Executive, so that we can trigger the start of the drawdown of the initial £46 million worth of funding?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, told me that he's met them before and he's happy to meet them again.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Efarydd. Plaid Cymru have been calling for 15 years for a law to ban politicians from being willfully misleading. New polling by Compassion in Politics shows that 73% of people support such a law. Will the Prime Minister support a lying in politics bill?
Mr Speaker, it is well known that the rules of this House demand that we tell the truth in this House, and that's what we all try to do.
Nick Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. PMQs for a constituency MP like me is a wonderful opportunity to ask the Prime Minister for a new hospital for Doncaster, maybe. Or maybe for Doncaster to be the home of Great British Rail headquarters. Sadly, Mr Speaker, there is a more pressing issue, and that is that men are dying so much younger than they should. So will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss the merits of having a Minister for Men and the benefits of a men's health strategy? That way, the next time I am fortunate enough to get a PMQ, I can lobby the Prime Minister for a new hospital for Doncaster and for Doncaster to be the home of Great British Rail headquarters.
Prime Minister.
I thank my friend, honourable friend, very much for his work in this area, and we are determined to tackle all the health conditions that he's describes and cares about, particularly mental health and suicide prevention. And I note his plea for a new hospital. I know it's one that's shared by many colleagues on these benches. This is the government that is funding that, making it possible, thanks to the decisions we've taken, allowing our economy to grow, which would not have been possible if we'd listened to them, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On this side, not only do we believe that lawbreakers can't be lawmakers, but also that tax raisers should be taxpayers. And when people in powerful positions pick and choose where they pay their taxes, that's an insult to everyone else who doesn't have that luxury. So can I ask the Prime Minister, how many members of his cabinet have ever been involved in a tax avoidance scheme?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what we try to do in this government is cut taxes for the whole country, and I'm proud to say that what the Chancellor did in the recent spring statement by lifting the threshold for national insurance contributions was to have a tax cut for about £330 for most people in this country. That's a fantastic thing.
Sarah Atherton.
Mr. Speaker, if you live in North Wales and want to watch international sport, you have to travel 4 hours to Cardiff or Swansea.
Shocking.
The Wrexham Racecourse, with its historic cop stand, is home to Wembley-bound Wrexham Football Club. It's the oldest international stadium in the world and forms part of our Levelling Up Fund bid. Would the Prime Minister agree that round 2 of the Levelling Up Fund offers an excellent opportunity to level up access to sport?
Well, there could be no better campaigner for Wrexham and for the interests of Wrexham sport. I will do what I can, Mr. Speaker, but she'll know that 121 million from the first round of the Levelling Up Fund was awarded to Wales, and I'm sure that Wrexham has every chance of success in the future.
Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has been asked about sodium valproate scandal previously, but Sean Linton at the Sunday Times this weekend revealed that campaigners were blacklisted, including my constituent Emma Murphy, who is here in the gallery today. Advice from the Cumberledge report has been ignored, warnings are still not on medication as of a couple of weeks ago, and a redress scheme is still not forthcoming. Will the Prime Minister meet with me and campaigners like Emma to discuss what can be done to right this incredible wrong?
Prime Minister.
I thank you very much for raising the point. I understand that we've had a review already of the issue, but I'll make sure that he has a proper meeting, or he and the campaigners that he mentions have a proper meeting with the relevant minister in the Health Department.
Robert Jenry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Aidan Aslin has served in the Ukrainian armed forces for 4 years. Last week, he was captured by the Russian army in Mariupol. Yesterday, a video emerged of my constituent handcuffed, physically injured, and being interviewed under duress for propaganda purposes. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that this is a flagrant breach of the Geneva Convention, that treating any prisoner of war in this manner is illegal, and that the interviewer, Graham Phillips, is in danger of prosecution for war crimes, and that any online platform, such as YouTube, which hosts propaganda videos of this kind, should take them down immediately?
I thank my right honourable friend very much, and I think everybody will want to will urge the Russian state to treat his constituent humanely and compassionately, because in my view, although we do not encourage people, in fact we actively dissuade people from going to that theatre of conflict, I understand that he'd been serving in the Ukrainian forces for some time, and his situation was very different from that of a mercenary, Mr. Speaker. I hope that he is treated with care and compassion. I thoroughly echo the sentiments that my right honourable friend has expressed about those who broadcast propaganda messages.
James Murray.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, this Conservative government is raising taxes on working people in the middle of a cost of living crisis. So can I press the Prime Minister on whether he agrees that it would add insult to injury if his Chancellor or any other government ministers were to benefit from overseas tax havens in their personal tax affairs?
Mr. Speaker. Good point, Mr. Speaker, but we are responsible for cutting taxes for everybody, which is what we're actually doing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Newcastle-under-Lyme is receiving over £50 million of government investment into our High Street and the High Street in Kidsgrove, in my honourable friend's neighbouring constituency. But it's all being overshadowed by the ongoing environmental disaster at Wally's Quarry. In January, the operator was hit by 3 Category 1 breaches by the Environment Agency. My constituents are utterly sick of it. It's been going on for far too long, Prime Minister. We need to see tougher enforcement. We need to see the permit taken away. What hope can you give my constituents? How can we stop the stink?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my honourable friend has raised this issue before, and I know how infuriating it is for his constituents. That's why my right honourable friend, the Environment Secretary, has now ordered action against the site operator, and permanent capping will begin on site next month. I can tell him that will improve things for thousands of residents in his constituency, and if it is necessary to take further action to remove these malodorous vapours, Mr. Speaker, then we will.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With details of the Sougray report trickling out, a flood of photos of Partygate yet to be released, and any number of fixed penalty notices liable to be leaked, this is a Prime Minister that's not fit to run a bath, never mind this country. It's time for him to stop this ridiculous charade that he believes no rules were broken. So will he commit to making public every fixed penalty notice he receives? Will he publish the party photos taken by the official photographer and ensure Sougray's report is published at the earliest opportunity? We have a right to know the truth.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on the my own fixed penalty notice, I've been transparent with the House. I apologise. On the rest of it, and will be, Mr. Speaker. But on the rest of it, I really think, as I've said before, that the House should wait to the conclusion of the investigation when Sougray will be finally reporting.
Sir John Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Long ago, in a far-off place, thousands of British servicemen sailed into what for them was the unknown as they witnessed the early tests of nuclear weapons. They've lived with the consequence of the service to our nation ever since. Following a PMQ from the Honourable Member for Salford, the Prime Minister has agreed to meet me and her and those veterans. But will he now assure the House that he will take personal charge of the decision on whether to grant the remaining servicemen, for there are few left, the service medal they so richly deserve?
Minister.
I thank him very much. I thank my right honourable friend very much. I thank him for campaigning on this issue, which I know attracts support across the House, and I certainly will take personal charge of the matter myself and make sure that they receive the recognition they deserve.
Liz Twist.
Mr. Speaker, my constituents across Bladen knew the rules and stuck to the rules. Nurses and teachers included. No after-work drinks for them. The Prime Minister set these rules. Night after night, he was on national TV to exhort us to stick to the rules for everyone's sake. Yet he continues to say that he doesn't think he broke any rules. My constituents are angry that while they stuck to the law, the Prime Minister broke it. Trust in his government is broken. So when will he go?
Mr. Speaker, I understand the feelings of her constituents, and I continue to express my apologies for the FPN that I received. But what the government is going to do is get on with tackling the issues that face this country and delivering for the British people, and that is my priority.
Robert Butlin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of my constituents, like many others across our country, has been helping directly with the humanitarian effort in Ukraine and the region, and he received a most troubling message from a resident of the city of Kherson only days ago, and I quote from part of it. "There are no green corridors for evacuation. People are trying to flee the city at their own risk under fire. The Russians are living in our homes. They are plotting terror, robbing, harassing, kidnapping and killing our people, doing whatever they want. Mr Speaker, what more can my right honourable friend and the international community do to ensure that Putin and those who do his bidding are brought to justice for their crimes?
Prime Minister.
Well, I think that my honourable friend is making an incredibly important point, because the savagery that the Russians are now unleashing on Ukraine clearly knows no limits and is clearly authorised from the very top. And she asked what more we can do. I think what we need to do is make it clear to serving officers now in the Russian forces that they will, if we can proceed with the international criminal prosecutions that we want to see, they will eventually face justice in the way that those who participated in massacres in Bosnia faced justice in the past. And I hope, Mr. Speaker, that that will have a chilling effect on their current appalling conduct.
Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, every week examples emerge of government waste during COVID. And last year, the former Health Secretary told me that there'd be no profiteering and no cronyism. Does the Prime Minister still agree with him?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think that a lot of people made money, I'm sad to say, out of COVID in a way that perhaps they shouldn't have done. And we deplore that, and we are trying to recoup as much as we possibly can. But I would just remind him of the constant clamour from those benches and around the country for us to equip our country with PPE, with medicines as fast as possible. And that we did, Mr. Speaker.
Russell. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Prime Minister join me in thanking the brilliant staff and volunteers at Watford General Hospital for their tireless work for our community over many years? And would he agree with me that we should get started as soon as possible on the ambitious plans put forward by West Herts Hospital Trust as part of the new hospital programme to transform healthcare across our whole community so staff and patients can access world-class health services in facilities fit for the 21st century? And, Mr. Speaker, if I may add, the ambitious plans are truly shovel-ready. I will gladly go and buy a shovel today to get started.
Mr. Speaker, he is a fantastic champion for Watford, and he's been. I know that because I've been to see him several times. He's been campaigning on this issue to get a hospital in Watford ever since he was triumphantly elected, and he's going to be successful because there will be a new hospital scheme in his local area, and it's part of our plan to deliver 48 new hospitals in this country by 2030, Mr. Speaker.
Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's fundamental political problem at the moment isn't about parties or fixed penalty notices or cake. It's about the lack of trust, integrity and credibility at the heart of government, which he himself now personifies. Mr. Speaker, when is the Prime Minister going to realise that people don't want to hear any more glib, half-hearted non-apologies or hear him witter on about getting on with the job? They just want this Pinocchio Prime Minister to pack his bags and go.
Mr. Speaker, I think when are the Scottish people going to hear any... sorry, Mr. Speaker, when are the Scottish people going to hear an ounce of sense from the Scottish Nationals?
Prime Minister, we both can't stand up at the same time. I'm trying to be helpful. We've got to be more moderate and taunting language use. Pinocchio is not acceptable. I'm sure the member wishes to withdraw it quickly.
Mr. Speaker, I withdraw that, but he packs his bags and goes.
Prime Minister.
It's not a withdrawal.
Withdrawn it. Sorry, you've withdrawn it. You win it. Let's get on. Prime Minister. Withdraw. Is that are you answering anything?
Sorry, I don't know what his question is, Mr. Speaker. He's withdrawn it, but the answer is that we're going to get on the job. Get on with the job. It'd be nice to hear an ounce of sense from the Scottish Nationalist Party or some competent government.
Rhys Villiers.
The London Borough of Barnes is surrounded by Labour councils, all of which have higher council tax and have abandoned weekly bin collections. So will the Prime Minister urge everyone to come out on the 5th of May and vote Conservative in order to keep council tax lower than Labour and to protect our weekly bin collection?
Quite right, Mr. Speaker. Conservative councils fix 4 times more potholes, recycle twice as much, and Conservative councils, Mr. Speaker, charge less.
Tom Hopkins.
Mr. Speaker, the Ministerial Code states that ministers have a duty to comply with the law and to protect the integrity of public life. The Prime Minister has broken the law and repeatedly shown contempt for the British public. Conservative MPs opposite seem content to decry the principles of honesty and integrity as they unashamedly defend him. The public want him gone, we want him gone. When will he do the right thing and resign?
Mr. Speaker, I know why they want me gone, because this government is going to get on. We are going to get on and show why this Conservative government is going to deliver for the British people, fixing our cost of living issues, making sure that we solve our long-term energy problems, and delivering on everything that we promised to do, Mr. Speaker. And they have absolutely no plan. That's the difference.
David Evan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On these benches, we were elected to make the most of our Brexit freedoms, including they don't like it, Mr. Speaker, they don't like it, but including tackling immigration, illegal immigration, securing our borders and crack down on the evil people smuggling trade. Does my right honourable friend agree that our groundbreaking partnership with Rwanda will do just that?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think it is a part of the solution. And it's something that, as I said just now, was advocated in 2004 by the then Home Secretary David Blunkett, a Blairite Home Secretary. It's now attacked in the most ludicrous terms by the current Labour opposition, who are obviously, as I've just said, Corbynistas in Islington suits.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wondered what the Prime Minister makes of this quote. When a regime has been in power too long, when it has fatally exhausted the patience of the people, and when oblivion finally beckons, across the world, you can rely on leaders of that regime to act solely in the interests of self-preservation and not in the interests of the electorate. His words, Mr. Speaker, Daily Telegraph, 28th of February 2011. Does he still agree? Yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, all I can say is that I'm delighted that she's a reader of the Daily Telegraph. I think what she needs to do is keep going to the end of the article. That's my advice to her.
What is it now? What are we going to now? We now come to the 10-minute rule bill.
That brings us to the end of today's Prime Minister's questions. Let me welcome our guests for this part of the programme on Politics Live. We have Simon Clarke, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Bridget Phillipson, Shadow Secretary of State for Education, and the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, Vicki Young. Welcome to all of you. Keir Starmer, unsurprisingly, in what could be seen as Act 2, following yesterday's clash with the Prime Minister, following his statement that included repeated apologies about receiving a fixed penalty notice and breaking the law on party at Downing Street. The questions today from Keir Starmer focus, certainly at the beginning, on why the Prime Minister hasn't resigned when others have resigned, citing Matt Hancock, the former Health Secretary, former Head of Press Allegra Stratton, and Neil Ferguson, Professor Neil Ferguson. Is there a sense now that the Prime Minister is struggling to contain this issue of Partygate? We still have more fines that could be given out by the Metropolitan Police.
Yeah, it's interesting because I did wonder whether Sir Keir Starmer, given we have local elections coming up, might decide to go on the cost of living crisis, actually, especially because, of course, yesterday, there was a lot in the House of Commons about all of this. But I think that they have realised, as you say, that there's more to run in all of this. And it is very difficult for the Prime Minister and Downing Street to close this down when you have this ongoing threat of more fines landing. They just get an email. They don't know if they're coming or not. They get an email to tell them that there might be another one coming down the track. And then all these allegations that he misled Parliament about it means that he isn't managing to move on. I mean, he says he wants to move on, of course, in the way that, He's talking about having these international virtual meetings and talking about Ukraine. He's off to India on a trip this week. But it isn't quite doing the trick yet. And Sir Keir Starmer going on this idea of responsibility. The Prime Minister has apologised numerous times, but he is still choosing to try to explain his actions by saying, look, it was 9 minutes in the Cabinet room, that's all it was. Really trying to appeal to people to say, come on, let's get some perspective here. There are bigger things going on in the world. This was a minor breach. Now, that works up to a point, unless you think that there are more of these fines coming. How could he then repeat that again? And that is what lots of Conservative MPs are worried about, that this is just going to keep rumbling on and on and on, and becomes, of course, a huge distraction.
I mean, Simon, what a lot of people will struggle to understand is why is it that Allegra Stratton, Professor Neil Ferguson, the former Health Secretary Matt Hancock resigned because they broke the rules? The Prime Minister has broken the rules. According to the Metropolitan Police, he's broken the law. Why hasn't he resigned?
The Prime Minister's been very clear that he apologises and takes responsibility for what happened in Downing Street, and he accepts the police's decision in full. But I do think it's important that we get on with the task of governing the country. Obviously, there's an awful lot going on at home and abroad which requires our attention. I think the Prime Minister is absolutely right to have apologised. I think everyone recognises the sacrifices that the country went through during the pandemic.
But he's broken the law.
But it is important, I think, to recognise that he in no way did so knowingly. He in no way did so in any way which I think could be described as either wittingly or lightly approach this question. It is the case that the police have found that the event that occurred, which, as Vicki has just said, it took place for a handful of minutes in the course of the working day between people who were necessarily in their place of work at the time that it occurred.
All right,
it was a breach of the rules. We accept that. He has apologised. But I genuinely believe that at a time when we have a very serious cost of living crisis and Ukraine's resolve,
and he says he's not going to resign. What
if
if more fines do come down the line and sent to the Prime Minister and Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor for that matter? But let's focus for the moment on Boris Johnson. If he is given more fines, is that sustainable?
I genuinely don't think it's helpful for me to speculate about what the police may or may not do. And obviously, context, as with all of these things, needs to be factored into whatever occurs.
All right, well,
but I believe that the Prime Minister is the right person to lead our country.
All right, well, let me say what you've said.
This government is doing the right thing.
Right, well, let me quote you what you've said before. Said the parties ought not to have happened, but that the Prime Minister is a good man and a good leader and has your full support. On the 8th of December, the Prime Minister said in response to a party on the 13th of November 2020, one of the ones the Metropolitan Police has investigated, he said, no, and I am sure that whatever happened, the guidance was followed and the rules were followed at all times. How does that square with what's now emerged?
Well, I take the Prime Minister's word at face value. I think he's, as I say, a good leader and a good person. I absolutely believe that he has done his utmost to uphold the law. Let's not forget, this is a man who's not only led this country through the pandemic and got us out of it before most other countries, restoring our freedoms in full, but he's also someone who doesn't take COVID lightly. He nearly died of it, frankly, during the course of this pandemic. I don't think anyone could say that he's unaware of the dangerous disease.
But that's not what we're talking about. There is an issue of trust and integrity. But Bridget Phillipson, the problem for Labour, despite the fact that you are going to have this motion tomorrow, and it will be about referring the whole matter of parties to the Privileges Committee to look at whether the Prime Minister has misled Parliament with the sorts of quotes I've just read out there. But it is bound to fail, isn't it? Because there are too many Tory MPs. I mean, it's the maths who agree with Simon. They're not going to vote for it.
Well, they can reflect on things overnight and can consider whether they want to continue to prop up a Prime Minister who's lied to Parliament, who's repeatedly lied to the British people, who went on television during the pandemic, night after night, telling the British people to follow the rules. He was right to do that. We all had a responsibility to follow the rules. People made the most extraordinary and heartbreaking sacrifices to do that. The Prime Minister, in the way that he's behaved, has shown a complete lack of respect for the British people, complete contempt. And you end up with this ridiculous spectacle of excuses being made for behaviour that we can all see is wrong, was wrong, remains wrong. He's got to go.
Right. I mean, Simon, if you do support the Prime Minister, and you do, obviously, I'm not, questioning that, you do support the Prime Minister, what's wrong with referring this whole matter to the Privileges Committee and let them decide whether the Prime Minister has told the truth or not?
I believe that the Prime Minister has apologised to the House of Commons. That is the point. He has apologised to the House of Commons. He's gone there repeatedly.
Well, then let it be referred to the Privileges Committee. If you're confident about the Prime Minister's stance and his position and his integrity on it, let the committee decide.
I absolutely believe the Prime Minister when he says that in no way did he construe, based on his reading of the events at the time, that what happened in the Cabinet Room that day constituted any kind of a party. Let's be clear, there wasn't drink, there wasn't some wild celebration. This was an event which occurred during the course of the working day. He has apologised for it. It was right to do so because clearly it does matter that the rules are followed. He accepts that completely, as does the Chancellor, as we all do, because frankly, we all went through a torrid time trying to live to these rules, and it did make a difference in getting our country through the worst days of the pandemic.
Why don't you trust the Privileges Committee?
I think we cannot continue with this constant process of introspection in Parliament about this.
This is going to continue for months. This is going to drag on.
Bridget, you and your colleagues obsess about this rather than about the cost of living crisis, rather than about...
Just the Labour Party. We've got plenty to say about the cost of living crisis. I can tell you, Simon, it's your Chancellor who doesn't.
Believe me, if you look at our action on this, you'll see we are the ones focused on getting our country through this crisis. That, in the end, is what matters here. He has apologised to the House of Commons and the country.
But as you know, it's clearly not enough, not even enough for many Conservative MPs, as we heard from Mark Harper yesterday, who's put in a letter of no confidence, and another Conservative MP, David Davis, saying it could be death by 1,000 cuts. Bridget, Rishi Sunak also received a fixed penalty notice for breaking the law. Should he resign?
Yes, he should.
Simon?
Well, I think for the Chancellor, it is an even harsher judgment has been applied here. I think he has...
Does he feel hard done by Rishi Sunak?
The Chancellor absolutely accepts...
He does.
He absolutely accepts the police's decision. But I feel it was a very tough reading of events. And I know the Chancellor works incredibly hard for this country. It's thanks to his economic leadership that we've come through this pandemic with such a strong economic position, with record numbers of people on payrolls. For my part, nobody could be better in charge of our national finances than Rishi, and I think he should be allowed to get on with his job.
Do you agree that that was in some ways unfair on the Chancellor, who certainly Treasury sources and Simon pretty well has said that he stumbled inadvertently on this particular event in the Cabinet Room to hold a meeting? I mean, it is up to the discretion of the police, of course.
The police have reached their conclusion. I think we have to respect that. It's the Prime Minister who seems to think somehow that rules are for other people. And, this is going to drag on for months. And on the cost of living crisis, Labour has got a plan to tackle gas and electricity bills for working people, for pensioners. The Chancellor hasn't brought forward anything meaningful on that. So this idea somehow that the government are getting on with the job, they're in touch with what the public want. I tell you, the public are pretty furious about having a liar for a Prime Minister who's lied to Parliament, lied to the people, and there isn't a plan for the cost of living crisis. Speak to people. They're in desperate situations.
£1 billion worth of support going into help with the cost of living crisis. It's just fundamentally not the case to say the government isn't acting on this.
But will they have to do more, Simon? Will they have to do more?
What we need to avoid is what the opposition are proposing, which are solutions which would actually make things worse, like a windfall tax on oil and gas, which would destroy the extra production from the North Sea that we need to generate. If you talk to the sector, that is exactly the disincentive that they say would prevent them from unlocking that.
So why has your party yet to come forward with a proper plan to help people through this incredibly difficult time? Instead, you've put up taxes time and again on working people. You haven't dealt with the cost of living pressures that people are facing. Childcare, the cost of childcare is a massive pressure on families. No plan for children's catch-up after the pandemic. I mean, this is not a government focused on the big issues. It is not focusing on the challenges.
Billions for children's catch-up in the spending review. £150 will be going into people's bank accounts literally this month to help with energy prices, and we've got a further £200 going in. No, £150 is non-repayable. The £200 in October.
But the £150 for households A to D, is that right?
But with discretionary funding of £144
but the rest is a loan, isn't it, to all households?
The second element, the £200, is to be repaid over 5 years.
Right. In terms of the money that the government is saying is going to go into pandemic recovery and also social care, I think to the tune of £36 billion, how would Labour find that money?
In terms of recovery from the pandemic?
And social care.
Yeah, so we wouldn't be putting up national insurance.
I know what you wouldn't be doing, but what would you be doing?
Yeah, we're an outlier on that in terms of the G7 major economies and the approach that they would be taking. We'd be taxing fairly. We don't think it's right, for example.
What does taxing fairly mean, Bridget?
OK, so I'll give you...
Yeah,
sure, absolutely. I'll give you one example. So where it comes to private equity and the carried interest loophole, we would make sure that changes. That's one example. We don't think we should be kind of hammering the recovery at a very fragile moment when, Simon is right to point to the challenges that we face both internationally and at home. But where it comes to pandemic recovery, if we don't get this right now and put in the investment that we need in our children's futures, the long-term damage to our recovery, to productivity, to growth, to all of the changes that we want to see, no, we would use the COVID reserve that the government had already allocated for that. It's a question of priorities. We think children's recovery, the impact on the economy, the long-term damage that will be caused matters most.
Rest assured, I scrutinise the public finances every day. There is no magic reserve sitting there which we could deploy in the way that Bridget is saying.
What's wrong with borrowing more then?
The fact we're going to spend £83 billion this year on debt interest is the reason we can't borrow more. It is for prudent management of the public finances that people elect Conservative governments. That is what we will deliver. The only way you can fund the backlog to deal with the over 6 million people on NHS waiting lists is with a broad-based tax increase. I did not come into politics to raise taxes, but we are dealing with the fallout from a really terrible situation where we had to take unprecedented action. That is why we're putting up taxes, to deal with that backlog and to address the long-term issues we all know we face with adult social care.
And Rishi Sunak will be back before October when there is expected to be another price hike in energy bills. Can you say now that he will come back to help people find the hundreds of pounds beyond the help that you have outlined, because they can't earn that money?
What I can absolutely say is that this government has shown time and again, whether it be with the furlough scheme or with the action we're taking on energy prices this spring, that we will act when it is required. We will monitor this situation as it develops, because so much of this, of course, hinges on how long a war in Ukraine lasts and the impact that
absolutely
has on
a lot
prices.
hinges on UK growth, which Rishi Sunak obviously talked about in the spring statement. You must be very disappointed by this headline from the International Monetary Fund, which I think we can show you, which is a BBC News story. UK set for slowest growth in G7 as Ukraine war hits global economy. Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak like to boast that the UK has the fastest growing economy at the moment, but that was obviously after the sharpest contraction. So we've gone sort of slowest, fastest, slowest.
I think it's important to contextualise what's going on, obviously, with the situation in Ukraine. And the UK is more exposed than, say, the United States is to some of the pressures of disengaging from the Russian economy. In terms of the G7 figures, it's really important to note that in 2024, we're set to be the second fastest member of the G7, and in 25 and 26, we're set to be the fastest growing member of the G7. So what is happening in 23 is an outlier, reflecting the fact that different economies are being impacted at different points in their recovery by some of these headwinds.
Right, so as I say, we're swinging, but we're going to be the slowest, certainly, according to,
Next year,
to the IMF.
Next year, we're forecast
and
to be
in
the
the
slowest,
G20, 19th out of the 20 economies, with only Russia being worse off than us.
There are very marginal differences between us and our major European contemporaries. And as I say, second quickest in 24, fastest in 25 and 26.
All right, let's talk about something else, because there was a row between the Prime Minister and Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, over what was said by the Prime Minister at a private meeting of Conservative MPs. Private-ish, because there are always reports to journalists and to the media about what was and what wasn't said. But this was a direct criticism that had been reported of the Archbishop of Canterbury, that he had misconstrued the policy of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. And the Church of England, and of course went on to say that they were more critical of that than they were of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The Church of England officials said that that is a disgraceful slur. What do we know?
Well, I think the context is really important here. Yesterday was an incredibly difficult day for the Prime Minister, and he went to address his MPs privately. And if you'd like to think about some subjects which might galvanise some support behind you, an attack on the clergy and an attack on the BBC might do that. So I think we have to think about this as being maybe a little bit of a distraction technique up to a point. Now, I think what's happened here, and we, of course, had our own intrepid reporters listening at the door and also listening to the briefings which come afterwards. Some Tory MPs do come out and tell us what's happened, and also Downing Street come out and give their version of what's happened. And as we reported last night across many of our outlets, including Newsnight and others, what happened was that the Prime Minister did criticise the BBC and the clergy, saying that they misconstrued the Rwanda immigration policy, but it was was the criticism about not being vociferous enough about criticising Mr Putin, well, that was directed at the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, what's happened is that newspapers and others have conflated those two. That's why then we had a row today with Sir Keir Starmer saying that the Prime Minister had in fact criticised the BBC's coverage of Ukraine, and the Prime Minister very strongly saying that wasn't the case. And of course no one would criticise Clive Myrie and all our other wonderful colleagues.
Absolutely, and Lise Doucette. Keir Starmer got that wrong, didn't he? Having just listened to what Vicki Young has said, the two issues were conflated. The Prime Minister said he did not in any way slander BBC reporters for their coverage of the invasion of Ukraine.
Look, he's right to ask the question, because what we saw yesterday was, on the one hand, the Prime Minister coming to the Commons chamber with a pretty half-hearted apology, mealy-mouthed apology, but then as soon as he's behind closed doors with his backbenchers, a different Prime Minister emerges. And there are no depths to which the Prime Minister doesn't want to seem to drag this country. So, you know, he criticises the Church of England, you know, the BBC, whoever. He just wants to stay in office. It is all about self-preservation. This has to be about what's right for the country. And to have a Prime Minister who has so debased the office... I mean, I can think of no former Conservative Prime Minister who would still be in office now, having behaved as this Prime Minister has behaved. He is dragging our country into the gutter in the approach that he is taking. It is bad for our democracy.
Do you want to set the record straight? Because the Prime Minister didn't actually criticise the BBC's coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Well, if that's the case, I'm happy to make that clear, absolutely.
Right, I mean, but he did criticise the clergy. He did criticise the Archbishop of Canterbury. I mean, do you want to apologise on behalf of the Prime Minister for saying that actually they were less vociferous, the clergy or the Archbishop of Canterbury, in their condemnation of President Putin than in their attack of the Rwandan immigration policy?
I think what I would absolutely say is I think that the policy that we've taken in regard to making sure we have control of migration to this country is the right one. I do not believe...
But that's not what I asked you. But that's not what I asked you, Simon.
I do not believe it is an unchristian policy, as the Archbishop said. I disagree with him very strongly on that. I don't believe it is tenable or right or humane for the situation that we've seen in the Channel to persist. I think we are absolutely right to take firm action in regard to that. I think that it's absolutely right also that we do correct the record. Nothing was said which impugns the quality of the
you were at the meeting, weren't you? You were there.
I was present at the meeting. I genuinely don't recall the full conversation. But what I do know is nothing was impugned about the coverage of the BBC. That certainly would have been in my memory if it had been. I think there is genuine frustration that there's been such strong criticism of the policy in regard to control of illegal migration. I passionately believe that to be the right thing
but that's not the same
to do.
As saying that he's basically, you're saying that the Archbishop has gone soft on President Putin. And Lambeth Palace have hit back at that, saying, look, when the invasion happened, he did call it evil. They are saying, and they're still saying now, that the bishops and others will continue to criticise policy if they think that they, you know, are against it. But that's different, isn't it?
I think inappropriately strong language has been used in regard to a legitimate policy choice.
But why make that comparison with President Putin?
To control illegal migration. I won't go further than that because I don't want to stoke that disagreement. But I do believe it was an inappropriate form of words. I think it does not reflect the views certainly of my own constituents, nor do I believe of the country. And polling would reflect that. I think it is absolutely right that we distinguish between the heinous evil which has been unleashed in
Although,
Ukraine
a little
and
bit,
legitimate domestic policy choices by an elected democratic...
Right, but if you don't mind me saying, you are perhaps guilty of doing what the Prime Minister is doing, which is distraction and deflection from the issue of COVID rules being broken with the coverage or the comments of the clergy in this particular case, of an immigration policy, which Priti Patel was talking about yesterday in the House of Commons. I mean, Bridget Phillipson's right. That's what this is.
I can promise you I have no intention of doing anything I can. I'm happy to say I think the Prime Minister was right to apologise for what happened in regard to Downing Street. But I'm also happy to say that I believe that our policy on illegal migration is right and that I think the Archbishop's comments were were unfair towards our legitimate need to control our borders. I think both can be true. There is no attempt at distraction. It is, of course, legitimate. But when the Prime Minister addresses the Conservative Parliamentary Party after weeks away, during which time
he's got to shore up support.
During which time both events have happened, it's perfectly reasonable for him to comment on both.
Sure.
And he did.
What the government has set out is just wrong, and the Church of England are quite right to share their concerns. It is the responsibility...
I doubt your constituents would agree, Bridget.
Well, I think, you know, British people do not want to see, no one wants to see people putting themselves at risk in small boats on the Channel.
Exactly.
However, this is not the way to deal with it. It will not solve that problem. The way to deal with that problem is to make sure we've got safe and recognised routes, because I think we have seen the incredible generosity of the British people, where we've seen people coming forward to house Ukrainian refugees. So I don't take the negative view that Simon does. I think people are incredibly generous, want to help. Yes, of course, we want to make sure that that is done in a way that doesn't see people put in harm's way.
Yes.
But we're not, unless we work constructively with the French authorities.
What does that mean? Because I have to say, without sounding tired of hearing the explanation, I have heard you want a fair system. I think everybody wants a fair system, better collaboration with France. But what else? What's new?
The French won't cooperate. This is the point.
We need safe and recognised routes so that people fleeing conflict and persecution can be settled in our country. We don't currently have that.
I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thank you very much to all of our guests today, and I'll be back tomorrow for what will be another big day in Westminster and that debate and vote. Bye-bye.